Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, we're at the end of March. It's been quite a March in the United States. Actually, I'm going to begin that again, Pete. That was a dumb thing to say. Hello, everybody. We are at the end of March. It's been quite a month in the United States. A couple of days ago, we did a show with my old friend Jonathan Rauch from the Brookings Institute on the growing political resistance to Trump 2.0. Rauch is cautiously optimistic about the political forces coming together to challenge Trump's assault on American democracy. I first came across John Rauch in a piece he co-authored with Peter Wehner in the New York Times 3 years ago now. What's happening on the left is no excuse for what's happening on the right. Both Wehner and Rauch are conservative centrists, I guess would be the best way to describe them, although Wehner and Rauch, probably their politics are quite different in some ways. But they've always been my reference point, morally and politically, for a critique of the growing authoritarianism in America. And just as I had the opportunity a couple of days ago to talk to John Rauch, I'm thrilled that we have the honor again of talking with the great Peter Wehner. His latest piece in The Atlantic, always the reference, I think, for the critique of Trump, is entitled "Trump's Appetite for Revenge is Insatiable." Peter is joining us from Wheaton College, just outside Chicago. Pete, I hope April's going to be a better month than March. Are you optimistic?
I'm not particularly optimistic. I'm not particularly pessimistic in terms of how things are going to go. I think we just have to wait and see. I am concerned, even alarmed, at the trajectory of the Trump administration. You know, he's been in office for 65, 70 days, which means he's got a little under 1,400 left to go. And so I think it's a lot of time to do a lot of mischief and a lot of harm. And I imagine he's going to try and do it. And I imagine he's going to get away with a lot of it.
Your Atlantic piece begins, "No one can say they didn't know." And Pete, you've been doing more than anyone, I think, to remind and warn people about Trump's lack of morality. As I said, you've always been my reference in terms of a moral critique of Trump. And this is the focus in the latest Atlantic piece, "Trump's appetite for revenge is insatiable." It seems to me as if, perhaps in contrast to John, who's more of a political thinker, that your critique of Trump and of the MAGA movement broadly is a moral one. Is that fair?
It probably is fair. I think it's just part of who I am. You know, when I first got interested in politics, which is when I was in my teenage years, I think I was drawn mostly to politics because I felt like that morality and justice were at the core of what politics was about. Now, that's not all politics is about. It's a complicated enterprise, and certainly has its dark sides, like all human enterprises do. But yeah, I think I've usually seen and started my journey looking at politics in part through a moral lens, and I think that's probably true to this day. It's not the only lens through which I view it, but I think it's probably the one that is most fundamental to my approach to things.
Yeah, it's worth reminding everyone that you're also a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum and a man who wears his religion on his sleeve. You're not ashamed to talk about your faith. In the Atlantic piece, you talk about revenge being the central theme for Trump. I don't think there's much debate about this. What is revenge, Pete? And why is it such a challenge to moralists like yourself?
Yeah, I think what revenge is not just a longing for recompense, or for bad things or evil things to be held accountable. I think that's a morally sound judgment. I think revenge is more a kind of a bloodlust. It's an emotion that is negative and often ugly, and it can crowd out almost every other emotion, the high and the noble ones as well, and it can become obsessive because it's driven, I think, by a deep anger, and that anger can be rooted in a whole series of things. It can be rooted in feelings of shame, of humiliation, and other things. So it's problematic. It's part of the human condition. We all have those feelings of revenge from time to time. I think we especially have it if we feel like we've been injured, or those whom we love have been injured. And as I said, it can be rooted, at least in part, in an understandable, even a right judgment. But I think it just has to be contained. Otherwise, it can overwhelm. It's a dangerous emotion in a democratic republic, or in any country for that matter, because it can become destructive and it can feed itself. And when you're in a cast of mind that is dominated by revenge, you can justify an awful lot and get away with an awful lot, because you're just so overpowered by those emotions. It's one of the reasons that the founders of this country were so concerned about taming the passions of human beings, not just revenge, but many others, because they knew the dangers of mob passion. Lincoln, in his 1838 Young Men's Lyceum speech, when he was still in his 20s when he delivered that, was really on that topic too, mob violence and what generated it.
You quote de Tocqueville, not for the first or probably the last time in your Atlantic piece, warning us about the vice of rulers. What did Tocqueville observe in the early 19th century that's still so relevant today?
Yeah, I think Tocqueville, who was such a great critiquer and analyzer of the American people and the country itself. Sometimes that's the gift that outsiders, foreigners have when they come to America. His concern was that when leaders acted in corrupt ways, that would send a signal to the citizenry, to the followers, that corruption is actually the way to get ahead, that it's the means to success. And I quoted Tocqueville because it was in the context of what I think is one of the most pernicious things about the Trump presidency, and probably not focused on enough in my estimation, which is his effects on the broader public, and how he is emotionally rewiring an awful lot of people, otherwise good and decent people, in ways that are harmful, and that his sociopathy, in a sense, becomes our sociopathy. His derangements, his conspiracy theories, his vengeance, his cruelty, his crudity becomes ours. Now, it's not a direct transfer. Obviously, some people are largely immune to it. A lot of people react against it. But I do think that that's the power of leaders, and especially the power of leaders in this age, in which they're kind of omnipresent, and because of social media and all the rest, they're constantly in our face. It's interesting that George Will, back in the early 1980s, wrote a book. It was actually based on a series of lectures that he had given, and it's called Statecraft to Soulcraft: What Government Does. And George is in a different place now. He's more libertarian now than he was then. But his core argument is that politics is by definition a moral enterprise, and that politics and statecraft shapes the soul, and that laws are teachers of morality and reinforcers of morality. And so we have to attend to those things. And when I read that book when I was a young man, it made sense to me then, and it makes sense to me now. And that's why I think Trump is in a sense the flip side of what George was arguing for, which is just as a statecraft can elevate people's sensibilities and refine their souls, if you get the wrong person in positions of power, can do the opposite.
George Will, of course, very distinguished columnist, I think is a Republican or was a Republican like yourself. I'm not sure if Will was ever formally associated with some of the Republican administrations as you were. In your piece, Pete, and it's a classic Wehner, very powerful, you refer to John Rauch and you say that Rauch wrote to you saying that the one thing that surprised him about Trump supporters was the sheer energy that's generated by transgression, the joy of breaking stuff and hurting people. Does that surprise you too, given your scriptural interest and references, your knowledge of de Tocqueville and the warnings about the potential corruption of the Republic? The stuff that John talks about is a kind of nihilism, isn't it? A violence for the sake of violence, an enjoyment in simply breaking things. It's beyond ideology.
Yeah, that's well stated, Andrew. I think that's right. No, I'm not surprised by that. I thought John's articulation was a very good one, and that's why I wanted to use it. But it's not shocking to me. It's not shocking to me just as a general matter, because I think if anybody studies human nature and human history, the history of politics, history of governments, we see these kinds of things throughout history, and there's the classic example, I suppose, would be what happened with the German people and Nazism and the anti-Semitism and all the catastrophe that followed there. But you see it, in Rwanda and the Serbians and the Bosnians. I mean, we could go on and on and on. That is part of the through line of history, and it is something in which we're susceptible as human beings, which is this kind of bloodlust. It is that when people do negative things and unethical things, and even cruel and awful things, that it can, in a sense, vivify people. It's really a weird thing. I mean, I really have seen this in the MAGA world over the last 10 years and how it shifted. I think at the beginning of the Trump era, there were an awful lot of Republicans, an awful lot of Christians. I am a person of the Christian faith that was attracted to his agenda, and they thought he was a fighter, but they were a little bit uneasy with his personality and his transgressions, personal and otherwise. And they viewed that as kind of a bug rather than a feature. But I could just see as time went on, month after month, year after year, as they made their accommodations to his transgressions, it began to light them up. They began to take a certain kind of joy, and they got a kind of dopamine rush out of the whole thing. And I think that really is a characteristic of Trump supporters in the MAGA movement now. Not all of them, of course, but an awful lot of them. There is a thrill in the exercise of cruelty, and Trump knows it, and his people know it, and so you see them playing to that all the time. It's gone way beyond just the phrase trolling the
yeah, I mean, you can see it.
Yeah, it's a celebration of cruelty.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it, for example, in these flights of supposedly illegal immigrants to the United States, to El Salvador, and the pleasure that some of these people seem to get in punishing people and throwing them out of the country. You talk about transgression. Pete, you've been also very outspoken in your critique of evangelical Christianity's association with Trump, their affection for him. You wrote an interesting piece just before Christmas this year for the Times. You're also a columnist there. Why it matters that Jesus came from a dysfunctional family. I'm not suggesting that Trump and his own dysfunctional family, certainly his relationship with his father, was part of the Christian narrative, may have even come out of the Bible. But there is an uncanny resemblance between the dysfunctionality of Trump, his life, his family, his story, and perhaps some of the stuff, some of the narratives in the Bible. Is that fair? Is that one of the reasons, conceivably, and it might be generous to the evangelicals, of why they themselves are so transfixed, addicted to these Trumpian transgressions?
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothesis. I'd have to think more about it. My first inclination is I don't think that exactly is the appeal to Trump to those people, with a caveat, and that caveat would be that it is true, at least for different subcultures within Christianity, the story of that kind of a redemption, or person having grown up one way, whose life was characterized by depravity, and then there's a 180-degree switch, and they come over to faith, and their lives are reformed and regenerated. Yeah, that's a powerful theme. We saw it in a way, I would say, with Chuck Colson, who was a hatchet man in the Nixon administration. It was said about Colson that he'd walk over his grandmother if necessary for Nixon. So he was a nasty piece of work. He got caught up in Watergate, was imprisoned, and had a conversion experience. It was true for Colson. He then founded something called Prison Fellowship, and the rest of his life was dedicated to ministry.
Did you ever meet him?
I did meet him. Yeah, I did. And Michael Gerson, who's a very close friend of mine and worked with Chuck, said that Chuck was a person who had the most transformed life that Mike had ever come across. And Chuck was impressive in his own right after his conversion. But I think there was something about the fact that, I was once lost but then found, that really appealed to Christians. I would say when it comes to Trump, what's missing is the hopeful part of that story, right? With Colson, there was a real conversion, and he gave words to it, and then his life changed. Trump's never really given words to it. He stayed just with a dysfunctional part of his character and his story. I think what appeals more to Christians as it relates to Trump is that they view him as a ruthless fighter against people that they really hate and they want to destroy. And in my experience in talking to people as far back as 2015, 2016, what they said at that time is somebody like Reagan or the Bushes or Romney were people of better character than Trump. But in a sense, they felt like those people were too genteel, and Trump would bring a pistol to a cultural knife fight, and that appealed to them. At first, it appealed to them because they thought that way we can win and protect what we believe is worth protecting and destroy the people that we think are worth destroying. But then over time, you saw this transition, which John was getting at, which is that it was the cruelty and the incessant, relentless conflict that seemed to give them energy and as I said, vivified them.
Yeah, going back to what John wrote, or what he told you about the surprise of their destructiveness, the joy of breaking stuff and hurting people. At the end of the 19th century, or in the 19th century, Dostoevsky warned us that this kind of nihilism would be the consequence of the giving up of religion. And it was also a theme, people like Nietzsche, of course. If if Christopher Hitchens was still around, Pete, he might say, given his anti-clerical, anti-religious inclinations, he might say, rather than not enough religion, all this nihilism is a consequence of too much religion. I don't want to speak on behalf of Hitchens, but how would you respond to that? Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, I do think there's a truth to that. You're exactly right that a lot of people like Dostoevsky and certainly the American founders, they believed that religion was essential to democracy, and the reason that the founders, almost to a person, despite their own religious beliefs, some of them were Christians, some of them were deists, some of them probably none, but they were champions of religion because they felt like religion was the anchor of morality, and that politics couldn't really supply that, certainly not enough. That what they wanted to do was put forward a system of government that they thought that was the best possible, which is checks and balances, separation of powers, and representative democracy, a republic, not a direct democracy. But they kept talking about the fact that the morality of the people had to be sufficient to tame the passions, and they felt like religion could do that. And that's a serious argument, and it's a historically valid argument that religion at its best can do that, and people can begin to internalize, if not perfectly, the Sermon on the Mount and many of the virtues that are championed in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the Christian New Testament and in other faiths as well. The flip side of that is that history is filled with examples in which religion did the opposite, which is it inflamed passions. It took all the intensity and the passions that are inherent in politics and added a kind of jet fuel to it, because it put the overlay of a kind of existential struggle: children of light, children of darkness, God versus Satan, and then it becomes a kind of combustible mix. And I would say today, in the American experience at this moment, that religion is more of a problem than a solution. I think that it is making our politics uglier. I think it's inflaming an awful lot of people in unfortunate ways. And just one other point on this, which is, remember when John Locke, who was so influential in the thinking of the founders, including about the so-called separation of church and state. I mean, John Locke had come out of an experience of 2 centuries of the so-called religious wars in the European continent. So he and others at that time were very aware of what religion could do. Religion's history, Andrew, is very mixed. There are moments of glory and humanization, the belief that people are made in the image of God and therefore are owed inherent human dignity. And there are moments in which it is judgmental, cruel, the trigger for war, and all sorts of other ugly stuff. So it's a mixed history, like so many other things.
What do you make of John's new book, Cross Purposes, in which he suggests that one way out of our mess, certainly the intolerance in America these days, is through religion? He's a self-described gay atheist Jew, so he's on the other extreme from you. But he sees in churches like the Church of the Latter-day Saints a way out, a model of toleration, even if the history of the Latter-day Saints, once known as the Mormons, is obviously racist and misogynist and all the rest of it. He sees some religions as being a solution, and he sees there being, I'm sure you're all too familiar with his thesis, an intimate, essential connection between religion and democracy in America.
Yeah, I think John is right. Religion is so interwoven into our country's history in ways that's just not the case with other countries, and that's just a given. And John, as you probably know from having interviewed him, said that the dumbest essay he ever wrote was in 2003 in the Atlantic, which was a celebration of what he thought was the dying of religion and the rise of secularism. I do think that there's something right at the core of that, because I think for an awful lot of people, faith is intrinsic to who they are. Excuse me. Faith is intrinsic to who they are. And I think that faith, rightly understood, can do a lot of good in individual life, in the life of a nation. And I think to try and reflect on how to heal the republic while excluding the role of religion probably is not a wise way to go. And you're right, John profiles at the end of his book and uses as a model the Latter-day Saints, because there is within the LDS now, as you said, it's got a checkered history, but now there is, I think, a disposition that is linked in part to some of the persecution that they suffered, a willingness to compromise and not to assume that they have to win all battles and get 100% of any given deal. But he's critical of what he calls thick and thin religion. So he's obviously very aware of the downsides of faith. I thought it was a very, very good book, because John is a wise and brilliant person. And the other thing that I respect about John is that he really has a kind of intellectual integrity and a disinterestedness. He is able to look at himself and others who hold his views and see the weaknesses in their arguments, as well as the strengths. The fact that he sees a place for religion is, I think, helpful, and I think it's in part because he's met over the years people of faith that have shattered some of the views that he had, caricatures perhaps in some instances of what he had, but also his own life experience when he was on the receiving end of a lot of ugliness because of who he is.
Yeah, I'm sure he's blushing now. I hope he's watching, Pete. Have you had any rather personal questions, especially for you? Have you had any personal crises of faith? Has it ever occurred to you through this increasingly dark period in American history that maybe you were on the wrong track in terms of religion, falling back on religion, given, as you suggest, the sometimes unsavory relationship between American religion and intolerance and hatred and destruction?
Yeah, it's a very good and intriguing question. I'll answer it in a couple of different ways. The first is that when I started my journey into faith, which is right at the end of high school and into college, I said at the time that faith wasn't easy for me. I remember telling my sister, who was a Christian at the time, she's 5 years older, and I said, Patty, it's like sand in the gears for me. It didn't come easily, and I asked so many questions. I had my dad's notepad, his notepad from work, and I would list question after question, and I would ask her and other people, how do you explain this? And to this day, Andrew, I am wrestling with issues and probing and asking, are certain things that I believed not true? And so that's been part of my journey. It's not a crisis in faith in the sense that I've, felt on the edge or verge of giving up on my belief in God or as a person, as a follower of Jesus. But a lot of the other stuff, has been at times up for grabs, and it's a constant process for me of refinement and reflection and seeking out the views of others, dialogue, discourse, debate. And I think that's who I am. That's how I'm wired. And I think that's how it will be, to my last breath. In terms of what it's brought out for me, as it relates to the political moment and the real, I would say, pain and discouragement that I've felt and because of what I've seen. which is the hypocrisy, the harshness of spirit, the judgmentalism that characterizes so much of, certainly I would say, white evangelical Christianity. Again, with a caveat that that's not true of everybody, and there are people of enormous integrity in my life and have touched my life because of their faith. But as it plays out on the stage, it's been really, really discouraging. It's not new to me. I mean, Mike Gerson and I wrote a book in 2010 called Religion, Politics, City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era. And we went through decades and even centuries of the mixed history of Christianity, including in politics. But living it out in real time and seeing the way that a lot of people who profess to be Christians are living out the faith has been discouraging. It's certainly put question marks to me around a lot of stuff, not who Jesus is, but who they are. And just to get a little bit theological, Andrew, it's probably not where you want to go, but
no, it's where I do want to go.
Okay, Christians believe in a concept called the Holy Spirit. Without going into too much detail, the belief is that when you become a person of the Christian faith, you're filled with the Holy Spirit, and the Apostle Paul in one of his epistles describes the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and self-control. Right? And the supposition is that you would expect to see those qualities more in people who are Christians than not, simply because from a Christian point of view, they would have access to something that non-believers wouldn't, right? And yet, when I look out, and I think when the world looks out at Christians and how Christians conduct themselves, often in their daily lives, and certainly, in the political lives, they don't see really much of a difference at all. And in fact, often they see the opposite, where they Russell Moore would tell a story where he spoke to a woman whose daughter had a crisis of faith. And Russell said, a generation ago, that crisis of faith would have been on, the validity of the canons, the canon of Scripture, or whether the crucifixion and the resurrection really happened, that kind of thing. In this case, the crisis was that this young woman went to her mother and said, the non-believers that I see, the atheists that I see, are showing more love and generosity and kindness than the Christians that I know. And that, to me, is not just a problem, but a conundrum, because I don't quite know what to make of it. Sometimes, as I said to friends, a bit tongue-in-cheek, it looks like the Holy Spirit has taken a sabbatical, and I hope he ends it soon. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that for me, the faith journey is not always a linear one.
Yeah, that's a nice image of the Holy Spirit taking a sabbatical. Maybe he or she or it is having a rest. One of the things, as always with Pete, with your piece, I really liked was its generosity of spirit. As I said, you're a deeply religious man, and as this conversation reflects, you've been doing a lot of religious thinking, one way or the other, self-critical and otherwise, about this. And yet, in your piece and in your way of addressing this crisis, you don't fall back, I think, on religion or religious figures. The standard response would be, well, let's look at the lives of Lincoln or MLK to underline the exceptionalism in the American narrative. But of course, that exceptionalism is now being questioned on every front. And the character that you choose to write about in this Atlantic essay is Václav Havel, who wasn't a believer, but of course offers a model for dissenting from totalitarianism. Why did you choose Havel in every front, as a non-American, am I right? He wasn't a Christian, was he?
No. Certainly wasn't an Orthodox Christian. I think it would be fair to say, I think he would have said that he was a person who was spiritual. But I don't think the Christian faith was one that he particularly proclaimed. Havel, like Solzhenitsyn, actually, really was an important figure decades ago. And when I wrote this essay, I actually pulled 4 or 5 of Havel's books off the shelf. I respected him so much for a number of reasons. One is I felt like he was a courageous truth teller, and he was a truth teller when there was a real cost to telling the truth, when he was a Czech dissident. He was a person of intellect. I'm not sure if he was a philosopher per se, but he was obviously acquainted with philosophy. He's a great playwright, and the aesthetics of human life really meant a lot to him. And I think that he reflected that in who he was and what he said and what he wrote. I thought there was a generosity of spirit in his approach, and he had a view of politics in which he said the moral origins of all what he wanted to come back to is the moral origins of all genuine politics is a phrase that he used. And then, of course, having been a dissident and having spent years in prison for speaking out against the communist government in the Czech Republic, he became the president of Czechoslovakia. And then his meditations and reflections on that, to me, were really, really interesting, and how in some respects it's easier to be a dissident than it is to be a president, because you can speak about and call people to high ideals, but then the practical implication, the practical application of those things is really complicated, and he faced that too. And then the last thing I'll say, and I quote this line from him in his essay in Summer Meditations, is there's only one thing I will not concede, that it might be meaningless to strive in a good cause, and that appealed to me too, because I do believe that we as individuals are called to act and do what's right and has integrity, and it may not succeed in any given moment in time. We just don't know that, because success is beyond our capacity to control. But what isn't beyond our capacity to control is our own lives, our own actions, and whether we do conduct ourselves with integrity. And Havel, I thought, embodied that.
Yeah, you talk about his moral origins of politics, and in that quote, you say, anyone who claims that he wrote, so anyone who claims that I'm a dreamer expects to transform hell into heaven is wrong. He was a realist. But there is a kind of Havelian quality to the moral drama, the moral theater we're observing, Pete. America spent decades fighting the godlessness, the supposed godlessness, immorality of communism, supporting guys like Havel. And now religious guys like you are falling back on Havel to protect American democracy from the very kind of authoritarianism that America was supposed to be fighting in the Cold War.
Yeah, I guess William Blake would refer to that as the fearful symmetry, in a way, of what is unfolding. I do think that that's a fair description of what's happening in America. I don't think that my life has been characterized by melodrama in terms of my writing. I don't think that that's a particular part of my personality or disposition. But I do think that we're witnessing an attempted authoritarian takeover. I just think that's where the facts and the evidence lie. And you use the word drama, and that, Andrew, is very much how I view this moment. This is a great and unfolding drama, and I wish it weren't, but it is, and we are where we are, and America at its best and its ideals are worth standing for and fighting for as best we can, given our stations in life and our seasons in life. This moment is unusual for America. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so disorienting for so many people, because we just really haven't been here before. And it is why, for me, the writings of people like Havel and Solzhenitsyn resonate. Because while this is our situation is still dramatically different than theirs. I think the stakes are the same. And again, to underscore what Havel and Solzhenitsyn talked about, was the importance of truth. Solzhenitsyn gave a beautiful Nobel Prize lecture in 1970. Well, he actually gave it later because he was in the Soviet Union at the time. He won the Nobel Prize in 1970, and he used the line that one word of truth will save the world. It was actually based on a line of Dostoevsky, and so the Nobel lecture was a meditation on that concept. And he too spoke about, and embodied in his life the importance of pursuing truth for the sake of truth.
Yeah, of course, Solzhenitsyn and Havel are very different kinds of characters. One
Absolutely.
thing about Havel that perhaps is worth noting is the role of humor. There is something so absurd now about Trump, about the kind of characters he's chosen to run the country. Should the resistance, Pete, be a little funnier? Should we be finding this? I mean, it's a tragedy, but it's also a comic tragedy. It's so absurd. Should we be laughing a little bit more rather than crying?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I sent out a link the other day. It's actually a link to The Daily Show, which is Jon Stewart and company. And it was a very, very funny bit on Trump. And I sent it to some people. And I said, well, we may as well laugh where we can. And I do think that humor is important. I will also say, Andrew, that I've always thought that humor was a much more powerful thing in politics than I think most other people do. Because humor, when it's done really well, whether it's through satire or other means, can deliver a punch, but it isn't, at least when it's done right. It's not done in a vicious way, and it allows people to sort of get the joke, and that there's some deep truth, some deep insight beneath the humor that it kind of names, but it's not malicious. So I thought in general that the humor is a very potent thing. I think some of the best politicians have understood that, and I do think that in this moment, because there is a tragic element to it, it's important to keep people's spirits up. I'll say one other thing, kind of along the same lines, which I've discovered in my life, and I've talked to other people about it too, which is it's extremely important, if you care about what's happening to this country and you're grieved by what's happening to this country, is not to let that fear, that concern, that anger to dominate your life, or to let Donald Trump dominate your life or imagination. Because in a sense, then he wins and that movement wins. And so we can't allow him or the MAGA movement to invade every sacred space in our lives. And so I do think we have to be intentional, and I've tried to do it, whether in my case, in the case of my wife, to go to the National Gallery of Art when there are exhibits that we want to see, or hike. My wife in particular does that, nature, music, and just to tune out at certain moments of the craziness that's happening, and to tune in to the rest of life, which can remind us of the enchantment of this world and the wonder of this world.
Yeah, speaking of the joke, it might be worth revisiting Kundera's book, The Joke, his novel, which is a wonderful satire. I'm not sure how gentle it is on the stupidity and incompetency of communist bureaucracy. I expect we'll have similar books about America. Finally, Pete, you talk about this moral theater, and I think, in a sense, would it be fair to say that we're all being called now? This stuff you wrote, you warned us, you've been warning us actually for years, but you warned us in November, this election is different. And you're right, it might even look different from the 2016 election. We're all being called to see how we behave. It's not just a stress test for American democracy, but it's a stress test for all of us. How are we going to deal with the fear, the challenge? Are we going to retire to private life? Are we going to do deals with the devil? Some law firms seem to have been doing deals with the devil, universities, everyone's being challenged with this. And I was really struck. You were on the Bulwark with Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of your magazine, editor-in-chief of Atlantic, a few days ago. I was really struck with Goldberg's interview. I'm not sure if you heard it on the New York Times. Here's a guy, I don't know the guy, you obviously know him. He seems so tough, so unwilling to budge an inch. I'm not sure whether or not he's religious. I'm not suggesting we turn Jeffrey Goldberg into Václav Havel or Solzhenitsyn. But are guys like Goldberg models? Should they be models, Pete, especially for the lawyers and the university presidents and the corporate CEOs who seem to be doing deals now with the devil, with Trump?
I think so. And I really would throw in to that litany media personalities in the press too. I mean,
who are doing deals or who are standing strong?
Doing deals.
Do you want to name any names?
Yeah, I think we're seeing it at the Washington Post with Jeff Bezos. I think it's pretty clear that the approach that the Post is taking is being informed in part because Jeff Bezos feels like he's got deals and companies that he's worried that Trump could attack. The degree to which so many institutions are going on bended knee to Trump has surprised me a little bit, and you've named a number of them, and that's exactly why people like Jeff Goldberg and magazines like The Atlantic are important because they haven't done that. And I was proud to be a part of The Atlantic once I joined them because I was so aware of the really remarkable history of the Atlantic, which was founded in the 1850s and was part of the abolitionist movement at that time, and just in terms of the arguments that it made. So it has a wonderful history. So for somebody like me, kid grew up rich on Washington, went to University of Washington, to be a part of the Atlantic was special. But I've never been prouder of being part of the Atlantic than I am now for precisely that reason. They have not bowed. They've continued to make the case. The story that Jeff broke about the signal cult that he was a part of was extremely important. And I think he's handled himself absolutely correctly. Initially, he held back on revealing some of the details. Then they went after him, character assassination, lies, nihilism, ad hominem, and all the rest. And he said, okay, he didn't reveal secrets that were going to put anybody into harm's way. But he showed that they were liars, and at a time in which truth tellers are contracting, it means that people who speak truth are more important than ever. So this is a stress test. John F. Kennedy said that there's a reason that profiles encourages a thin volume. Courage is an uncommon human trait, an uncommon human virtue. And we're seeing that play out now. And I think that's the reason why when you find people who have some measure of courage and integrity and are willing to speak up for what's right, when it's hard to do that, increasingly hard to do it, it's worth acknowledging those people, celebrating them, and where possible, defending them.
Is it worth giving a shout out then to Lauren Powell Jobs, who owns The Atlantic? I'm guessing that she and her board had lots of conversations with Jeffrey Goldberg over this leak, whatever you want to call it, on national security. In contrast, say, with Jeff Bezos, who's clearly folded with Trump. Should we commend Jobs?
I certainly would. I mean, I'm not privy to any of those conversations, but I've certainly had private conversations with people not at The Atlantic, but just friends of mine, on exactly that point, and how grateful I am that she is where she is, and that she's holding firm the way that she is, because it isn't easy. one of the reasons, Andrew, that I wrote as often as I did, warning about Trump, was precisely because I felt like if he won, we were going to become, in many respects, spectators in the Trump drama, and the capacity to prevent him from the harm that he's doing would be extremely limited. It doesn't mean that there are no options, but especially now at the outset of his administration, the room for action for the opposition is limited. And when I look at what he is doing, whether it's the decimation of the Global AIDS Initiative, PEPFAR, or USAID, or the National Institutes of Health, I mean, you go through it. This is not just a wrecking ball on the load-bearing walls of democracy, but there is profound human carnage that's following. Millions and millions of people are going to die because this man and his people decided to gut and ruin programs and slander people in the process for no reason other than to do it. And to see the fact that he did it, I kind of understand, because I've always argued for as long as he's been part of the public stage in 2015, 2016, that he's a person that's suffering from sociopathy. So I think for Trump, morality is to Trump what color is to a person that's colorblind. I don't think he can even see morality, but the people around him can. And the fact that these people are complicit in this effort to do so much harm, especially to the most innocent and vulnerable people, is just awful, and it's only getting started. And so that underscores again the need for people to speak up and to stand up, and to know that this, even if this is a difficult, dark season in our national story, it's not the end of the story. And there are inflection points in a human life, and there are inflection points in the lives of nations, and we need one in the United States right about now.
We're saying not the end of the story if Pete Wehner is around. It's the opposite, I think, of Donald Trump, whereas Donald Trump sees no morality anywhere. Pete sees it everywhere. Keep doing your brave, noble work, Peter Wehner. We will talk again in the not too distant future. Happy April, and keep well, and most importantly, keep safe. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. I appreciate what you're doing.
Step on the scene, I'm ready to attack. Andrew King, yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He's the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew King, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.